My ex-wife and I had been divorced for almost a year, but we still needed to settle things with the cabin. We bought it together a few years back, deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was meant to be our escape from the world, a place to reconnect. But things didn't work out, and now we had to meet one last time to figure out what to do with it. I arrived first. The drive seemed longer than usual, probably because I hadn't been there since the split. The cabin looked the same, but it felt different, like it was holding on to memories that had turned sour. I unlocked the door and went inside. The air was musty, and dust had covered everything. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace to warm up the place, then sat on the worn-out couch waiting. Late in the afternoon, she finally showed up. I saw her car through the window. She stepped out, looking just as I remembered. Maybe a little more tired, a little more worn out. She didn't come in right away. I could see her outside, staring at the cabin, maybe thinking about what we had lost. When she finally came inside, there was no need for words. We both knew why we were there. I showed her around, pointing out things that needed fixing. She nodded, but I could tell she was just as eager to leave as I was. The place held too many old memories. After we made our decisions, we went our separate ways in the cabin, checking on different things. I went to the back where the woods met the edge of the property. The trees were thick, and the shadows had started to stretch out, making everything look darker. I felt uneasy standing there, like something was watching me from the trees. I shook off the feeling and went back inside. She was in the kitchen, looking through the cupboards. I went to the bedroom, the one we used to share. The bed was still there, covered in an old quilt. I sat on the edge, staring out the window at the woods. The same uneasy feeling came back, stronger this time. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the cabin felt different, like it had changed since we were last there. I stood up and walked out of the room, heading back to the living room. She was there, sitting on the couch, staring into the fire. I sat down across from her, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. The fire crackled, and the shadows danced on the walls. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I felt like I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to leave her alone. As the sun started to set, I suggested we leave. She agreed. We gathered our things and stepped outside. The air was colder now, and the woods were darker. As we walked to our cars, I glanced back at the cabin. It looked empty, like it was waiting for something or someone. We didn't say goodbye. We just got into our cars and drove off. I didn't look back again. The road out of the woods was long and winding, but I was glad to be on it. I kept driving, the cabin fading from my mind with each mile. A few days later, I got a call from her. She was staying at her sister's place, far from the cabin, but she said she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She felt like she was being watched, like something had followed her from the cabin. I didn't know what to say. I had felt the same thing, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to believe that the cabin had any hold on us. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin, dark and empty, waiting in the woods. That's when I realized it wasn't the cabin that had changed. It was us. The cabin was just a place made of wood and stone. But we had left something behind, something we couldn't get rid of no matter how far we drove. The cabin had become a part of us, a part we couldn't escape. It was always there, waiting, watching, and no matter where we went, it followed. The cabin was just a building, but what we left behind had become something else, something we couldn't run from. The scariest part? I began to notice that wherever I went, I felt that same eerie presence. Every place I stayed, every new location, seemed to carry a hint of that same unsettling feeling. I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear faint creaks and see shadows moving just beyond my vision. The silence was never truly quiet, always filled with a subtle, almost imperceptible sound of something or someone lurking just out of sight. One night, while lying in bed, I felt a cold breath on my neck and heard a whisper that I couldn't quite make out. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the room, but nothing was there. Yet the feeling of being watched never left. I realized then that the cabin had followed me, not as a place but as a presence, a lingering shadow that had become part of my life. Now, every time I move or change my surroundings, I keep expecting that feeling to go away, but it doesn't. I have come to understand that no matter where I go, that part of me, that piece of the cabin's dark past, will always be with me, waiting, watching. And that thought is what keeps me up at night, knowing that I'll never truly escape the shadows we left behind. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, so I rented a cabin deep in the woods. My nearest neighbor was about a mile away, and I only saw him once when I first got there. He was an older guy, probably in his late 50s, with a rough look that made me think he might have been in the military. He had a few American flags on his porch, and I could see what looked like a rifle hanging on the wall inside his cabin. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time fishing, reading, and just enjoying the quiet. But on the fourth night, something changed. I was lying in bed, about to fall asleep, when I heard a low rumble in the distance. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. The rumble grew louder, followed by sharp, popping sounds that echoed through the trees. It was gunfire. I sat up in bed, heart racing. It sounded like it was coming from my neighbor's cabin. The gunfire went on for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped, leaving the night dead quiet. The next morning, I decided to check on my neighbor. I walked the mile to his cabin, but when I got there, it was empty. The door was slightly open, and the inside was a mess. Furniture turned over, holes in the walls, and a few empty bullet casings on the floor. But what really got my attention was a map spread out on the kitchen table. It was marked with a few spots, and next to it was a note that read, "They're watching. They know. Don't trust anyone." A cold shiver ran down my back. Who was watching? What did they know? And why did my neighbor leave so fast? I looked around the cabin one last time, but I didn't find any answers, just more questions. I decided to head back to my cabin and pack my things. This trip was over. As I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made me jump. By the time I reached my cabin, I was in full panic mode. I threw my stuff into my car and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away from the woods that I felt like I could breathe again. But even now, back in my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, watching me. Something that knows I saw that map, read that note. I haven't slept well since, and I keep thinking about my neighbor. Did he get away, or did whatever he was running from catch up to him? The more I think about it, the more I realize I was better off not knowing anything at all. But deep down, I know that whatever it was hasn't forgotten about me. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like it's getting closer. And the worst part is, I don't know when it will come for me, but I'm sure it will. It's just a matter of time before it finds me. And when it does, there won't be anywhere left to hide. I was alone in the cabin with my stepbrother, Tom. We were supposed to be having a relaxing weekend away from our busy lives, but something felt wrong. The cabin was small and isolated, hidden deep in the woods. We'd stayed here before, but this time it was different. The first night passed without incident. just the usual creaks and groans of an old cabin settling into the cold. I slept lightly, waking every few hours to the sound of branches tapping against the window. But the second night was unsettling. Around midnight, I heard a noise, a faint scratching sound coming from the roof. I told myself it was probably just animals, but the noise kept getting louder. Unable to sleep, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the forest. The scratching sound had stopped. I looked at the roof but found nothing unusual. I tried to brush off my worry and went back inside. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps moving around the cabin. Tom was asleep in the other room, and these footsteps didn't match his usual movements. I quietly got out of bed and checked the cabin, but everything seemed normal. The door was locked, and the windows were secure. Just as I was about to head back to bed, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I'd locked, was slightly open. My heart pounded as I pushed the door wider and saw fresh footprints in the dirt outside. They were too small to be Tom's, and they led into the forest. I knew we had to leave fast. I woke Tom and told him what I found. We packed our things quickly and drove away from the cabin, the forest disappearing behind us. The whole drive back, I felt like we were being watched, and that feeling didn't go away. When we finally got home and looked at the footage from the cabin's security camera, it was disturbing. Someone had come close to the cabin that night, but the camera had been messed with, and the footage was mostly broken. We could see only blurry shapes and shadows, nothing clear. We never went back to that cabin. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was waiting for us in those woods. The cabin had been our escape, but now it feels like a place where something dark and dangerous lurks, always just out of sight. It haunts me, knowing that whatever was there might still be watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor. I was thrilled to spend the weekend at my grandfather's cabin out in the woods. I had great memories of the place from when I was younger. Days of hiking through the trees and nights sitting by the fire. Now, at 17, I needed a break from the busy city life. When I got there, the cabin looked just like I remembered. Old and weathered, sitting at the edge of a thick forest. Since there was no electricity, I brought a lantern and some candles. After getting settled, I spent the afternoon checking out the area and getting things ready for the night. As night fell, the forest filled with odd sounds. I wasn't scared. I knew the noises of the woods. But tonight, the rustling of leaves felt louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint scratching noise from outside. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or another animal, but the noise didn't stop. It got louder and more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get in. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the lantern and looked out the small window. The light cut through the dark, showing only trees. I decided to check it out, thinking maybe an animal was stuck somewhere. I put on my boots and went outside, holding the lantern to light my way. The scratching sound was now mixed with a soft thud, like something heavy being dragged. I followed the noise to the back of the cabin and found the source. There was a big hole in the ground recently dug, and the dirt around it was disturbed. I immediately thought that someone might have been trying to bury something or someone. I felt a chill as I realized how alone and exposed I was. Anyone could have been hiding in the forest, watching me. I quickly went back inside, locked the door, and set the lantern by the window. The scratching continued, but I felt a bit safer inside. I stayed up all night, listening to every little sound and jumping at each creak. By morning, the scratching had stopped. I didn't see anything unusual outside, but the hole was still there. I packed my things quickly and left. I didn't tell anyone what happened, thinking it was better to keep it to myself. When I got home, I looked up the area and found out it had a history of vandalism and strange happenings. That made the night at the cabin even creepier. I never went back to the cabin. The night's experience left me with a cold, unsettling realization. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the noises or the dark, but the thought that someone or something was out there, waiting for the right moment to come closer. My grandmother's cabin was isolated deep in the woods, a place I used to visit as a kid. After she passed away, I inherited it. I hadn't been back in years, but I decided to spend a few days there, hoping to relive some old memories. The cabin looked just like I remembered, old and worn with wooden walls and creaky floors. I unpacked my stuff and settled in. The first night was quiet. The only sounds were leaves rustling and the occasional hoot of an owl. The second night, I woke up to a strange noise outside, like a soft thud. At first, I thought it was an animal, but when it happened again, I got curious. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check. The thuds were coming from the old shed behind the cabin. The shed had always been locked and unused, a leftover from my grandmother's time. I carefully walked over, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The door was slightly open. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. Inside, the shed was full of old tools and boxes. The thuds were louder now, coming from the corner where a big tarp was covering something. My heart pounded as I lifted the tarp. Underneath was a wooden crate, old and beaten up. I opened it with shaky hands. The crate held old newspapers, dusty photos, and some odd items. A rusty knife, a few old coins, and a broken locket. As I was about to close the crate, I noticed something else, a small leather journal. I opened the journal, and the pages were filled with my grandmother's handwriting. She wrote about her life, her happiness, and her fears. The entries were normal until they started to get dark. She wrote about feeling watched, strange noises at night, and a growing fear. The last few pages were especially chilling. She mentioned a man she was scared of, someone who had followed her from town and seemed to be lurking around the cabin. Reading it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The noises outside had stopped, and everything was eerily quiet. I stayed up the rest of the night, my mind racing with the thought that someone might be out there, just like my grandmother had feared. The next morning, I checked around the cabin more closely. I found some footprints near the shed, faint but clearly human. It hit me that my grandmother's fears might have been real, and someone could still be out here. I packed up my things quickly, feeling a deep sense of unease. As I left, I locked the cabin behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. It seemed peaceful, but I knew better. I never went back to the cabin. I made sure it was properly secured, but the journal and the footprints left me with a lingering fear. The cabin became a haunting reminder that sometimes the things we fear the most are closer than we want to admit. It was clear to me that my grandmother's fears were real, and whatever she had been scared of was still out there, waiting. I needed to get away from the city, so I found the oldest cabin I could rent out in a far part of the woods. It was miles away from anything, surrounded by trees and complete silence. The cabin looked ancient, with dark, worn out wood that creaked whenever the wind blew. Inside, it was just as basic. No electricity, only an old stove that used wood, and a few candles. The floor was uneven, and the air smelled of damp wood and age. The first night was quiet, but on the second day, strange things started happening. It began when I went out to collect firewood. I saw a stack of logs already cut and neatly piled up against the cabin wall. I hadn't done it, and I was sure nobody else was around. The closest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone since I got there. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like it was trying to tear the cabin apart. I could hear branches snapping outside and the old wood groaning under the pressure. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard something, a light tapping like someone was knocking on the walls. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I found something else strange. The front door was wide open, swinging on its rusty hinges. I knew I had locked it before bed. The ground outside was wet and muddy from the storm, but there were no footprints leading to or from the door. It didn't add up. I felt like someone was watching me. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to take a walk, hoping some fresh air would help. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were no sounds. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Just the crunch of my footsteps on the leaves. The deeper I went, the more I felt like something was pulling me in a certain direction. I stumbled across an old trail that I hadn't seen before. It was overgrown, almost hidden, but something about it made me keep walking. I followed it for what felt like hours until I reached a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was another cabin, even older and more broken down than the one I was staying in. It looked like no one had touched it for decades, maybe longer. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The door to this cabin was hanging open, just like mine had been. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in dirt and broken wood. It was dark inside, but something in the corner caught my eye. It was an old, cracked mirror, the glass dirty and cloudy. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were faint handprints on the glass, like someone had pressed their hands against it from the inside. My heart started pounding. I turned to leave, but something stopped me in my tracks. In the reflection of the mirror, I saw the shape of a person standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nobody there. The cabin was empty, just like it was when I walked in. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. I didn't waste any time. I ran out of there as fast as I could, heading back to my cabin, thinking I'd be safe there. But when I got back, something was off. The firewood was gone, the door was shut tight, and the windows were closed. It was like I had never left, but I knew I had. My head was spinning as I tried to figure out what was going on, but nothing made sense. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I quickly packed my stuff and left, driving away from that cabin as fast as possible. As I reached the edge of the woods, I looked in my rearview mirror, and my heart nearly stopped. In the distance, I could see that old cabin I found deep in the woods. It was standing right where my cabin had been. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but then, right before my eyes, it vanished, like it was never there at all. But the worst part was when I glanced at the passenger seat. The old mirror from the cabin was sitting there, the glass covered in fresh handprints. I had been counting down the days to my weekend at the cabin. Work had been wearing me down, and the idea of getting away from everything for a few days in a quiet, far-off place sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who hardly ever used it. When he offered it to me, I didn't hesitate to take him up on it. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The road that led to it was narrow and twisted, with trees pressing in on both sides. By the time I finally arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself was small but warm, with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and just one bedroom. It was simple, but it was perfect for what I needed. The first night was quiet. I made a quick dinner, read a little by the fire, and went to bed early. The stillness of the woods felt calming, and I fell asleep easily. The next day, I spent most of my time outside, checking out the area around the cabin. The woods were thick with lots of undergrowth that made it easy to get turned around. I made sure to keep the cabin in sight as I walked, not wanting to get lost. As the day went on, though, I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving in the trees, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me because I was alone in a strange place. That night, the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. The woods, which had felt so peaceful the night before, now seemed to be hiding something. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling just kept getting stronger as the hours passed. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The cabin was completely dark, and every creak of the wood or rustle of the wind outside made me jump. At some point in the night, I heard a noise that made my heart skip a beat. It was soft at first, a faint scratching sound coming from the kitchen. I froze, listening closely. The scratching kept going, getting louder, more insistent. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It had to be an animal, I told myself, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten inside somehow. But the more I listened, the less I believed that. The scratching sounded too deliberate, like someone was trying to get in. I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching stopped as soon as I walked into the room. I stood there in the dark, listening, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, just silence. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were all locked. They were. I even looked outside, shining a flashlight into the darkness, but I didn't see anything unusual. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be some kind of animal and went back to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every little sound put me on edge, and I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I felt drained and jittery. The scratching sound from the night before was still stuck in my head, but there was no sign of anything strange in the cabin. I decided to cut my trip short and leave that day. I packed up quickly and loaded everything into the car. As I was about to leave, I took one last look around the cabin. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the outside of the front door, just below the window, there were deep scratches in the wood. They were fresh. The wood beneath the paint was raw and exposed. The marks were too big to have been made by any small animal. They looked like someone had been trying to claw their way inside. A cold shiver ran through me as I realized how close I had been to something dangerous. I hurried into my car and drove away as fast as I could, leaving the cabin and whatever had been out there far behind. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had been to whatever was out there. The scratches on the door were proof that something had been there, something I couldn't see or hear. It had been close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to almost get inside while I was sleeping, completely unaware of how much danger I was in. That was the last time I ever went to that cabin. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those scratches and wonder what would have happened if whatever it was had made it inside. Would I even be here to tell the story? I'll never know, and that's what haunts me the most. Something was out there in those woods, something real, and it almost got me. I never thought I'd run into him again, especially not here. The cabin had always been my safe spot, a place where I could get away from everything. After the divorce, I found myself coming here more often. It was far out, quiet, surrounded by thick trees, the perfect place to escape. That day, I got there late in the afternoon. The sun was setting behind the trees, and long shadows stretched across the small yard in front of the cabin. I unpacked the car, brought my bags inside, and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth and crackling of the fire helped me relax. felt good to be away from everything. I made some coffee and settled into the old chair by the window, looking out at the woods as they got darker. But something didn't feel right. The usual peace I felt here was replaced by a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on stress. But then I heard it, a twig snapping outside. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But as the night went on, the sounds kept happening. Footsteps crunching in the leaves, moving around the cabin. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light enough to be just an animal either. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me as I looked around the tree line. Nothing moved. I stood there for a while, listening. The woods were too quiet, unnaturally quiet. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to calm down. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. The uneasy feeling kept growing stronger. Every little noise made my heart race. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finally decided to try and sleep, hoping I'd feel better in the morning. I got into bed, keeping the flashlight close. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again, the clear sound of footsteps on the porch. My heart pounded in my chest. Whoever it was, they were right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened, hoping they'd go away. But the footsteps didn't leave. Instead, they moved along the side of the cabin, stopping right outside the bedroom window. I stared at the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But there was nothing. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The footsteps finally moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there in the dark, listening for any sign of movement. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but too scared to leave the cabin. I stayed inside, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. As the day went on, I started to relax a bit. The daylight made everything seem less scary. I even managed to step outside for a moment, just to get some fresh air. I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of who or what had been there the night before. That's when I saw them. Footprints, human footprints, circling the cabin. They were fresh, too fresh. My heart sank. I quickly packed my things, throwing everything into the car as fast as I could. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was about to leave, I noticed something in the dirt near the cabin door. A small, folded piece of paper, weighed down by a rock. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. It was a note written in his handwriting. 3 words, "I'm watching you." I dropped the note and backed away, my heart pounding. I jumped into the car and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I never returned to that cabin. I never told anyone what happened, but the fear never left me. Even when I'm alone in my own home, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there, watching. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I heard those same footsteps outside my window, and I know, no matter how far I run, that he'll always be out there, somewhere, waiting. I came across the cabin while hiking through thick woods. It was an old, run-down building, barely visible through the dense trees. The place looked abandoned, like it had been forgotten for years. The wooden walls were faded and gray, the roof was weighed down with moss, and the windows were covered in dirt. Something about it made me want to check it out, even though a small part of me felt uneasy about it. I decided to go inside, thinking it might be a good place to take a break. As I got closer, the air around the cabin seemed different, heavier. The front door made a loud creaking noise as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the quiet woods. Inside, The cabin was dark and smelled musty, like old wood and rot. There was a wooden table in the middle of the room with a few broken chairs around it. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for who knows how long. I stepped inside, leaving clear footprints in the dust. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I noticed that the walls were lined with shelves filled with jars. They were covered in dust, just like everything else, and it was hard to see what was inside them in the dim light. I wiped the dust off one of the jars and saw that it was filled with something that looked like dried plants. Another jar held what looked like small animal bones, brittle and fragile. Suddenly, I heard a creak from the floorboards. I froze. It didn't come from where I was standing. My heart started to race as I turned around to look behind me, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty, just like when I walked in. I told myself it was probably just the old wood shifting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Trying to ignore the uneasiness crawling up my back, I kept exploring the cabin. There was a narrow staircase leading to an upper floor. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed up, the wood feeling weak and ready to give out. The upper floor was just as dusty and abandoned as the rest of the cabin, with an old bed pushed up against one wall and a large, wooden chest in the corner. The chest caught my attention. It was big, made of dark wood, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I walked over to it, curiosity getting the better of me. The lid was heavy, and I had to pull hard to open it. Inside, I found a pile of old, moth-eaten clothes, some yellowed papers, and a small metal box. The box was locked, but the lock was rusty and weak. I managed to break it open with a few tugs. Inside the box were old photos, black and white, the edges worn and curling. The photos showed people, families, couples, children, posing in front of the same cabin I was standing in. The clothes they wore were old-fashioned, from a long time ago. As I flipped through the photos, I noticed something strange. The same man was in almost all of them, standing in the background, his face partly hidden or blurry. He was always there, watching, but never clear. A cold shiver ran through me as I realized that the man wasn't part of the families in the photos. He was just there like a shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at the last photo in the stack. It was a picture of the cabin, taken from the outside. And there, standing at the window, was the man, staring out with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. I slammed the box shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. Something was wrong with this place, something dark. I rushed down the stairs, almost tripping in my hurry. As I reached the bottom, I noticed that the front door, which I had left open, was now closed. The unease in my gut turned into full-blown fear. I yanked the door open and bolted out of the cabin, not looking back. As I ran through the woods, I felt something behind me, something cold and unrelenting. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the cabin, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. When I finally dared to look back, the cabin was hidden by the trees, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about those old photos, about the man who was always there, lurking in the background. I never went back to that part of the woods again, but the memory of that cabin and the man in the photos still haunts me. Even now, every so often, I feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm sure I'm alone. Sometimes, when I'm in the dark, I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow, but it's enough to make my heart race. I know it's probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't shake the feeling that the man from the photos is still out there, watching, waiting. And I'm terrified that one day, I'll turn around and see him standing there, in the background, just like in those old photos. And this time, he won't be blurry. He'll be real, and he'll be right there, watching me with those empty, dark eyes. I didn't expect my weekend to turn out like this. My neighbor, Sam, invited me to his cabin for a few days. We weren't close friends, but we got along fine, and I thought it would be a nice break. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any main roads. Cell service barely worked, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of animals. The first day was normal. We fished at a nearby lake and chopped wood for the fireplace. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. That night, as we sat around the fire inside, I started to feel uneasy. The darkness outside felt oppressive, like the trees were closing in on us, as if the forest was alive and watching. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the isolation getting to me. But as the night went on, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I barely slept, waking up at every creak and groan of the old cabin. The next morning, Sam suggested a hike deeper into the woods. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't want to seem scared of a few trees. We set out, following a trail that twisted through the dense forest. The trees were so thick in some places that it felt like twilight, even though it was the middle of the day. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following us, but there was nothing. We reached a small clearing after about 2 hours. Sam wanted to keep going, but I was done. My nerves were shot, and all I wanted was to get back to the cabin. We turned around, retracing our steps. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail looked different. Trees that should have been familiar felt out of place, and some turns seemed sharper than I remembered. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired. Then we reached a fork in the trail that we hadn't passed before. There were no signs, no markers, just two paths going in opposite directions. Sam didn't seem worried. He shrugged and picked one, saying it didn't matter which way we went since both should lead back to the cabin. But deep down, I knew we were lost. The sun was sinking, and the woods were getting darker. The sounds around us changed too. What had been the peaceful hum of nature now felt eerie, like something was moving in the shadows just out of sight. I tried to stay calm, to focus on finding our way back, but with every step, my anxiety grew. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled upon the cabin again. I felt relief as I saw the familiar shape through the trees, but that relief was short-lived. As we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The cabin looked different, older, more worn down. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. We had locked up before leaving. Sam pushed the door open. The inside was cold, much colder than it should have been with the fire we had left burning. Everything was in disarray. The furniture was overturned, and there were deep scratches on the walls, as if something had clawed at them. A heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by the faint creaking of the floorboards. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was in the cabin with us, something that had been waiting. Without saying anything, Sam and I grabbed our things and headed for the door. But as we stepped outside, the reality of our situation hit me. The woods were dark, the trail impossible to see. Even if we could find our way back to the car, we were miles from the nearest town. We were trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere. We spent the rest of the night in silence, too afraid to sleep or move. The minutes dragged on, the air thick with fear. I kept my eyes on the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. Nothing ever happened. When the first light of dawn came through the windows, I made up my mind. We had to leave immediately. We packed up what little we had and left the cabin without looking back. As we reached the car and drove away, the tension started to ease, but it never fully went away. Something had changed in those woods, in that cabin. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back, and I'll never talk to Sam about it. Some things are better left forgotten, but I know I won't forget. I'll always remember that feeling, the certainty that something was out there, watching, waiting, and I'll always wonder if it's still there, in those woods, waiting for the next person to wander too far from the safety of the trail. The worst part? Sometimes, late at night, I can't help but think that whatever was waiting for us didn't just stay in that cabin. It might have followed us back. I drove up to the old cabin, a place full of memories from my childhood. My grandmother had always loved it here, hidden away in the woods, far from the city noise. After she passed away, the cabin was left to me, and I decided to spend a weekend there alone to clear my head and remember her. The cabin looked just as I remembered, with its old wooden walls and the small porch that overlooked a quiet, dark pond. The trees around it seemed to lean in, making long shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I settled in, unpacked, and decided to take a walk around the property to enjoy the fresh air and solitude. As evening came, I headed back to the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly open. I was certain I had locked it, but I brushed off the thought, figuring I must have missed it. I closed it firmly and went inside, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing noises outside, rustling leaves, soft thuds, and what sounded like footsteps. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but the noises were too clear. I turned on all the lights, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and even moved a heavy chair in front of the back door for extra security. The noises grew louder as the night went on, almost like someone was deliberately trying to scare me. Around midnight, I heard a loud bang coming from the storage shed at the edge of the property. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy flashlight I kept for emergencies. I knew I had to check it out, even though every part of me wanted to stay inside. I approached the shed carefully. The door was slightly open, swinging in the light breeze. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a messy pile of old tools and rusty equipment. I shone the light around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to head back, I noticed something unsettling. A set of fresh, muddy footprints leading from the shed to the back of the cabin. They were large and recent. My heart sank as I followed them back to the cabin. The prints stopped right at the edge of the porch. I ran inside and locked the door, my mind racing. Whoever had been outside was clearly trying to get in. I moved the chair away from the back door and decided to stay up, keeping the lights on and listening for any sounds. The night dragged on, but the noises eventually stopped. As dawn broke, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. I decided to pack up and leave early. When I was finally ready to drive away, I noticed that the muddy footprints had been washed away by the rain that had started in the early morning. It seemed like whoever had been there had left just before the storm began. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sense of unease lingered long after I left the cabin. That night, I found a small note hidden under the seat of my car. It was handwritten and simply said, "You were not alone. Watch your back." I never found out who left it or what they wanted, but the realization that someone had been so close, that they had left a message, left me with a chilling reminder. Even in the places where you feel safest, danger can be closer than you think. I had rented a remote cabin for a week, hoping to get away from city life. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The cabin was old but had a cozy feel with its stone fireplace and wooden floors that creaked under my feet. The first few days were just as I hoped, peaceful and relaxing. But on the fourth night, things changed. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard a noise outside. It was a soft scratching sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. I thought it was probably a small animal or a branch hitting the side of the cabin. The scratching went on and off all night, getting louder and more persistent. By morning, I was uneasy but tried to convince myself it was just the wind or animals. I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. As I walked through the woods, I noticed something odd: big, deep scratches on the trees, all pointing towards the cabin. The scratches were fresh, with dark stains on the bark that looked like dried blood. When I got back to the cabin, I saw that the door was slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it tightly. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open, checking the room for any signs of someone breaking in. Everything seemed in place, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. That night, the scratching started again, but this time it was more intense. I decided to check it out, grabbing a flashlight and a heavy wrench I found in the cabin's storage closet. I went outside, shining the flashlight around the cabin. The light revealed something disturbing: footprints leading away from the back of the cabin, where the ground was freshly disturbed. The footprints were large and human-like, but they just stopped, as if the person had disappeared suddenly. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and groan of the cabin making me jump. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I packed my things quickly, always looking over my shoulder. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The scratching had stopped, but the unsettling feeling remained. A few weeks later, I found out from a local that there had been reports of someone in the area who stalks cabins, sometimes vandalizing them or worse. It hit me hard. I'd been alone in a place where someone with bad intentions could have easily been hiding. The realization was chilling. It was a stark reminder of how isolated and vulnerable one can be, and how quickly a peaceful getaway can become a terrifying ordeal. As I think back, I wonder if that scratching noise was a warning that someone was out there, watching, waiting. The thought that someone might have been hiding in the woods, just beyond my sight, still sends shivers down my spine. We were sent to a remote area deep in the woods, far away from any town. The old cabin we were assigned to looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The roof was a little crooked, and the wood had turned gray from age. There was something creepy about the place, but it was where we had to stay for the next few weeks. First, everything was normal. The nights were quiet, filled with the usual sounds of the forest. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and an occasional owl hooting. But then things started to feel different. It began with small noises. I thought it was just the old cabin settling at first, but soon I noticed the sounds were too regular for that. It was like someone was moving around outside, walking in circles around the cabin. I would sit up in bed, listening hard to catch every little sound. The whole time, I felt like someone or something was watching us from the darkness just beyond the trees. One night, I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, almost like whoever it was knew we were inside. I held my breath, hoping they'd go away, but they didn't. Instead, the door creaked, like someone was trying to open it. The latch held, but the door kept shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I grabbed my rifle, my hands trembling as I pointed it at the door. But just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I was left alone in the silence, with nothing but the sound of my own breathing. The next day, I found footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal prints. They were from a person. Barefoot, deep prints, like someone had been walking around all night. The others shrugged it off, saying it was probably one of us fooling around. But I knew better. There was something wrong out here, something that didn't want us here. The last night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening. And then I heard it again, those footsteps, but this time they were inside. They were slow, careful, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. I stayed still, trying to tell myself it was all in my head. But then I heard breathing, low and rough, coming from the corner of the room. I was frozen with fear. I wanted to jump up, to grab my rifle, but I couldn't move. The breathing got louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to me. I could feel its heat on my face, smell the nasty odor that came with it. And then, just like that, it stopped. The next morning, I packed my stuff and left the cabin. I didn't care about orders. I couldn't stay there another minute. As I walked away, I could feel eyes on me, watching me leave. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew whatever had been there with us was still there, and it wasn't going anywhere. It was just waiting for the next group to come along. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I'll never forget that cabin, the way it felt like it was alive, like it was aware of us the whole time. And I'll never go back. Some places are better left alone, no matter what anyone says. The worst part, every now and then, late at night, I can still hear that breathing. It's like a faint echo, just out of reach, as if the cabin found a way to follow me. Maybe it's all in my head, or maybe once you've been there, a part of you never really leaves. And that thought, more than anything, keeps me up at night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away. My ex-wife and I thought that spending a few days in a cabin far away from everything might help ease some of the tension after the divorce. We didn't have kids, so there was no reason to stay in touch, but there was still a lot that hadn't been talked about. We figured that a quiet weekend in the woods might help us leave things on better terms. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any town, and there was no cell service. It was a small, old wooden place with one bedroom, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen. It felt like the kind of place that had been there forever, like it had seen a lot of people come and go. The first night was quiet. We made a simple dinner, talked a little, and went to bed early. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that feels more like an agreement to avoid certain topics than a natural part of being alone in the woods. We both pretended to sleep, but it was clear that neither of us was comfortable. The unease was too strong to ignore. The next day, we decided to go for a walk. The paths around the cabin were narrow and overgrown, but we figured it would be a good way to pass the time. We walked for hours, barely speaking, just listening to the sound of our footsteps and the wind in the trees. It felt like the forest was watching us, the way the trees seemed to close in as the path narrowed. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was almost dark. That night, something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was like the cabin itself was alive, watching us, listening to us. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that being so far away from everything was making me paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. In the middle of the night, I got up to use the bathroom. The cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the last bits of wood burning in the fireplace. As I walked down the hallway, I heard a noise behind me, a soft creak like someone was stepping on an old floorboard. I stopped and listened, but the sound didn't come again. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing, just the empty hallway leading back to the bedroom. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, closer this time, like someone was right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hallway was still empty. My pulse was racing, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I got back to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every little sound the cabin made. It felt like the place was shifting, groaning under some invisible weight. My ex-wife was sleeping soundly beside me, unaware of the tension growing inside me. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, but the feeling of being watched only got stronger. The next morning, I woke up to find her gone. Her side of the bed was cold, the blankets pulled back neatly. I called out her name, but there was no answer. I searched the cabin, but she was nowhere to be found. Her things were still there, her bag and clothes untouched. Panic started to set in. I ran outside, shouting for her, but the woods seemed to swallow my voice. The path we had walked the day before looked different, almost like it had never been there. I had no idea what to do, so I went back inside, hoping she had just gone for a walk and would be back soon. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of her. I tried to tell myself she had just left, that she had decided to go without waking me up. But the car keys were still on the counter, and her phone was dead on the nightstand. As night came, the cabin felt colder. The dread I had felt the night before returned, but it was worse this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her, something I couldn't explain. The silence in the cabin was crushing, pressing in on me from every side. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the dying flames, waiting for something to happen, for her to come back. But she never did. When the morning finally came, I grabbed my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the police. They searched the woods for days but found nothing. No sign of her, no clue that she had ever been there at all. I still don't know what happened to her that night. The cabin is still there, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the next person to stumble upon it. Sometimes I wonder if it was the cabin itself that took her, like it needed something from her, something it couldn't get from just anyone. I've never gone back, and I never will. Whatever happened in those woods, it's something that will stay with me forever. The memory of that place haunts me, a dark shadow I can't escape, whispering that some things should never be found. And every now and then, in the dead of night, I wake up with the feeling that I'm still being watched, that whatever was in that cabin followed me home, waiting for the right moment to take something from me too. My stepsister and I had been talking about this cabin trip for a while. We both wanted to get away from the busy city and have some quiet time. The cabin we found was small, hidden deep in the woods. It took us hours to drive there, but when we finally arrived, it looked perfect. It was surrounded by tall trees, and there was nothing around for miles. No people, no noise, just peace and quiet. It was exactly what we were looking for. The first night felt normal. We unpacked our stuff, made something to eat, and sat by the small fireplace. There was no phone signal, no TV, nothing but the sound of the wind and the woods outside. At first, it felt kind of nice, but the quiet started to feel heavy after a while. I couldn't stop noticing how silent everything was. By the time we went to bed, I was feeling a bit weird about it, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to this much quiet. The next day, we decided to walk around the woods near the cabin. The trees were really thick, and there weren't many clear paths. It felt like we were the only people around for miles. After walking for a while, I saw something strange. There was a pile of rocks stacked neatly near a tree. It didn't look like it was there naturally. Someone had to have put them there. Something about it made me stop and stare. My stepsister didn't think much of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside seemed louder, and I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps just outside the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I stayed awake, listening for every little sound. The footsteps would come and go, like someone was slowly walking around the cabin. It would stop, then start again a few minutes later, like they were circling us. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved nothing bad had happened. My stepsister was still asleep, so I stepped outside to get some air. That's when I saw it. The same pile of rocks from the day before, but now it was closer to the cabin. I hadn't noticed it there last night. It was just sitting at the edge of the clearing, like a marker. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it had always been there, but I knew it hadn't. I didn't tell my stepsister about it. Maybe I was just overthinking. We spent the day trying to enjoy ourselves, walking further into the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. The deeper we went into the woods, the more it felt like someone was following us. But every time I looked around, there was no one there. When we got back to the cabin, there was another pile of rocks, right by the front door. This one was bigger, taller, like someone had been working on it while we were gone. My skin crawled, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Someone was playing with us, messing with our heads, but there was no sign of anyone around. No footprints, no sound, nothing. That night was worse. I woke up again to the sound of footsteps, but this time they were louder and closer. My heart was pounding as I lay in bed, too scared to move. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin, and then I heard a soft knock on the window. It wasn't loud or fast, just a slow, quiet tap, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. But they weren't in any rush. They knew I wasn't going anywhere. I didn't dare look. I just stayed there, my eyes shut tight, waiting for it to go away. It felt like forever, but eventually, everything went quiet again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, my stepsister finally noticed the rock piles. She mentioned how strange it was, but she didn't seem scared, just confused. I couldn't take it anymore. I told her we needed to leave. Something wasn't right, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what was going on. She didn't argue much, but I could tell she thought I was overreacting. As we packed up, I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching us the entire time. We loaded up the car and started down the dirt road, and I felt a bit better. I thought maybe we were finally safe, getting away from whatever had been out there. But as we turned onto the main road, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing in the clearing, right where the rock piles had been. He wasn't moving, just watching us leave. I couldn't see his face clearly, but it didn't matter. The fact that he had been out there the whole time made my stomach drop. He had been there watching us, and we never knew. The worst part was realizing how close he had been to us, how easily he could have done something if he wanted to. As we drove away, the feeling didn't leave me. The thought of him standing there, watching us like we were prey, stuck with me long after we were gone. And then it hit me we were lucky to get out when we did. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. And whatever he was waiting for, I'm terrified that we almost found out. I was sent out for a solo night shift. The call came in about a cabin way out in the woods, miles away from any main road. The dispatcher said someone reported hearing strange noises, maybe an intruder. Seemed like a routine call. I drove out there, the cabin sitting in the middle of thick trees. It was completely cut off, with nothing but forest and silence all around. The air was cold, and the light from my car barely lit up the trees. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I could feel it. This silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like something was off. My breath felt loud in the air. I turned on my flashlight and slowly walked toward the cabin. It was old, falling apart. The door was closed but didn't seem locked. As I reached for the handle, I stopped. I heard a soft creak from inside. It wasn't loud, more like someone moving but trying to stay quiet. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My flashlight cut through the darkness, showing me the small living room. There wasn't much, just an old couch, a small table, and some dusty shelves. No sign of anyone. I moved carefully, checking each corner. My heart was beating faster now. The air inside felt stale, thick. I went through each room, but I found nothing. The windows were all shut, and it seemed like no one had been there for a long time. Except for one thing, a faint, sour smell, like something rotting. I figured it might be a dead animal, but something caught my eye. The rug in the middle of the living room looked slightly out of place, like someone had moved it recently. I bent down and pulled it back, revealing a hatch, a small wooden door set into the floor. It wasn't locked. I froze for a second, then lifted it. A narrow set of stairs led down into a basement. I pointed my flashlight down, but it barely lit anything. The smell got stronger as I walked down, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, the air felt damp and hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered as it moved across the room, showing a dirt floor and wooden beams. Then I saw it, piles of dirt, like something had been buried there. In the corner, a rusty old shovel leaned against the wall. I stepped closer to the dirt piles, my heart racing now. That's when I saw it. A hand, half buried in the dirt. It was pale, lifeless, fresh. The skin still looked new. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Someone had been buried here recently. I rushed back up the stairs, slamming the hatch behind me. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. Nothing. I stepped outside, and the woods felt even worse, like they were closing in on me. I hurried back to my car, but as I reached for the door, I stopped cold. The driver's seat was covered in blood. The car had been locked when I left it. No one had passed me in the woods. I stood there, my mind spinning. Whoever buried that body wasn't gone. They were still out here watching me. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the car slowly, pulling out my gun, my eyes darting through the trees. But the silence was back. That strange, heavy silence that told me I was alone, and at the same time not alone at all. As I stood there, I noticed something on the ground by the edge of the forest. Footprints, fresh ones, heading away from the cabin. They weren't mine, and they weren't leading deeper into the woods. They were circling around. Whoever it was, they had been watching me the whole time, following me, and they weren't done yet. I realized then I wasn't getting out of these woods. Not alive, anyway. It was 1996, and I took a short trip to the German countryside. I rented a small cabin, far out in the woods, away from any towns. The cabin was simple, old, with wooden walls that creaked when you walked. The air outside was chilly and damp, but inside, once I lit the fire, it was warm enough. I didn't really have any big plans. I just wanted to relax, maybe take a few walks in the forest to clear my head. The first few days were quiet. I spent my time reading and walking the narrow paths around the cabin. The forest was thick, and if you didn't pay attention, you could get lost easily. I didn't see many animals, just some rustling in the bushes now and then, or a bird flying by. On the third night, something felt off. As the sun started to go down, a heavy fog rolled in, covering the trees and making everything around the cabin disappear. Felt even more lonely than before. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something about the quiet started to bother me. There were no usual sounds, no wind in the trees, no animals moving around. I went to bed early, hoping to sleep it off, but as I lay there, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a soft scratching sound from outside. At first, I thought it was a tree branch against the cabin, but the noise didn't stop. It was steady, sharp, like something was dragging across the wood. I tried to ignore it, but it just kept going. It sounded like it was right outside my window. I sat up, straining to hear. The scratching changed to a light tapping, like someone or something was touching the window, feeling it out. I felt a shiver run through me, but not from the cold. I didn't move. My heart was racing, but I stayed frozen in place. The tapping went on and on. I kept waiting for it to stop, but it felt like it never would. And then, all of a sudden, it did. The silence that followed was worse. I lay there, tense, expecting something else to happen. I didn't move, didn't even breathe too loudly. But after a long while, there was nothing. Just the thick, heavy quiet of the fog outside. I stayed awake the whole night, staring at the window, waiting for the sound to come back. But it didn't. When the first light of morning came, I finally got out of bed. I felt uneasy, but I needed to know what had been making that noise. I walked over to the window and looked closely. There were thin lines on the glass, like something had scratched it. I knew then I wasn't staying another night. I packed my stuff quickly and stepped outside. The fog was still hanging around, making the whole place feel strange. I was ready to leave, but when I walked around the side of the cabin, I froze. In the dirt right under the window were deep tracks. They were uneven and strange, not like anything I'd seen before. Too long and narrow to be from any animal I knew. My heart was pounding. I didn't want to figure out what it was. I grabbed my stuff, threw it into the car, and got out of there, not even looking back. I never found out what made those sounds or left those tracks. Part of me doesn't want to know. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the soft tapping at the window, like it was waiting for me to come closer. I always wonder what would have happened if I had. Would it have come inside? Or was it just waiting for the right moment to get in? I always loved going to my grandmother's cabin. It was deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees, and far from the noise of the town. Out there, it was peaceful, a place where I could breathe and clear my head. Every summer growing up, I spent a few weeks with her, helping around the cabin, going on hikes, or just sitting on the porch, watching the trees sway. But this summer felt different. Maybe it was because I hadn't been back in years. Grandma had passed away a couple of years ago, and the cabin had been empty since then. I was the only one in the family who still cared about the place. My parents wanted to sell it, but I convinced them to let me keep it. I wasn't ready to let go, so I decided to spend the weekend there by myself just to be in that space again. When I arrived, everything looked the same. The old rocking chair still sat on the porch. The air smelled like pine trees, and the wind rustled the leaves like it always did. But there was something off this time. It wasn't obvious at first, but it grew on me. Maybe it was the silence, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making everything feel too quiet, like something was missing. Even the birds weren't chirping, which was strange for a place like this. I shook it off, thinking I was just overthinking things since it had been so long. I spent the day cleaning the cabin, airing it out, and putting things back in place. By the time night came, I was exhausted. I sat on the porch with a beer in hand, looking out at the dark forest. The trees were completely still, and the only sound was the creaking of the porch under my chair. It should have been peaceful, but the quiet started to bother me. The cabin never felt this lonely before. I went inside, locked the doors, and decided to go to bed early. The cabin grew cold as the night went on. I lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying to fall asleep, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering close to the cabin. But then I heard it again, and this time it was clearer. Footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone was trying to walk quietly on the porch. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. The cabin had no curtains, so I could see the faint moonlight coming through the windows. Shadows of the trees outside moved gently, but there was something else moving too, closer. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. I lay there, hoping I was imagining things. But then I heard a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the door. My chest tightened. No one should have been out here. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived, and the nearest house was miles away. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make any noise, and grabbed the flashlight from the table. I crept to the door, heart racing, and looked through the small window. In the dim light, I saw movement, but it was hard to make out what it was. Something or someone was definitely out there. I backed away from the door, unsure of what to do. The scraping sound continued, louder now. I thought maybe it was an animal, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I moved quickly to the back door, the one that opened into the woods, and quietly unlocked it. The cold night air hit me as I slipped outside, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin, away from whatever was out there. I didn't have a plan, but I knew staying inside wasn't an option. I moved through the trees, trying to stay low and quiet. The forest felt different, heavier, like the darkness was pushing in on me. I could still hear the scraping in the distance, but it was fading as I moved farther away. I found a spot between some thick trees and crouched down, listening, trying to calm my breathing. I waited there for what felt like hours, my body stiff from the cold and fear. The noises from the cabin stopped eventually, but I didn't move. I was too scared to go back. I waited until the sky started to lighten with dawn before I worked up the courage to return. When I got back, the front door was wide open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. I stepped inside cautiously. Everything looked the same except for the front door. It had deep scratches across it, long and rough, like claw marks. But no animal could have made those. They were too perfect, too intentional. There were no signs of anyone around, no tracks, nothing. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my stuff and left, not looking back at the cabin. I haven't told anyone what happened that night, and I haven't been back since. The cabin is still in my name, but I'll never go back. Whatever was out there that night, it knew I was there, and I'm not sure it was ever planning to leave. Felt like it was waiting for something. Maybe it still is. It was a cold November weekend when my college friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains to get away from exams. The cabin was far from anything, tucked deep in the woods, and we thought it would be a perfect break from our busy campus life. We got there in the late afternoon, and the setting sun made long shadows through the trees. The cabin was old but cozy, with creaky floorboards and a big stone fireplace that crackled with warmth. We unpacked and spent the evening playing games and hanging out. By midnight, the cabin was quiet except for the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I had the top bunk in the room we had turned into a makeshift dorm. As I was trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint noise coming from outside. It sounded like something scratching or dragging across the ground. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just branches hitting the cabin or maybe an animal. The noise got louder and more persistent. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin. I got up, went to the window, and looked out. It was so dark I couldn't see anything but trees and shadows. I decided to check it out, thinking it was probably just a branch stuck somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me hard. The noise was clearer now, definitely something scraping. I walked around to the back of the cabin, shining the light around. The ground was covered in leaves and dirt, but I couldn't see what was making the sound. Then I saw something strange, a fresh trail of disturbed earth leading away from the cabin. The trail was narrow and seemed to lead towards a small, overgrown shed we hadn't noticed before. My heart started to race. The noise had stopped, but I felt uneasy. I approached the shed, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The door was slightly open, and I hesitated before pushing it wide. Inside, it was completely dark, and I could barely make out old tools and a few rusty barrels. I didn't see anything strange, but the creepy feeling didn't go away. Just as I turned to leave, the flashlight flickered and went out. I struggled with the batteries, my hands shaking. When I finally got it working again, the light revealed a dark figure standing just outside the shed. It was tall, and its shape blended into the shadows. Fear hit me hard, and I ran back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, breathing heavily. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had seen. In the morning, we discovered deep, jagged claw marks on the cabin's wooden siding. It looked like something had tried to claw its way in. We packed up quickly and left, feeling a heavy sense of dread. As we drove back to college, no one said much about what happened. It was clear that whatever we had seen wasn't just an ordinary animal. The cabin had seemed like a fun escape, but it ended with a terrifying reminder that sometimes being alone in the woods can bring you face to face with something you're better off not knowing. And the worst part? The claw marks were still there, deep and ugly, a silent witness to whatever had been trying to get inside. I had always wanted to get away for a weekend, away from the noise of the city. Renting an old cabin in the woods seemed like a good idea at the time. I found one online, cheap, far from everything, no cell signal or internet. It sounded perfect. I packed up a few things, grabbed my sleeping bag, and left early that Friday morning. When I got there, the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was old, built from dark wood that had seen way too many winters. The roof drooped a bit, and the windows were small and dirty, hard to see through. There was a little porch with one rocking chair. Trees surrounded the cabin so tightly that only a bit of sunlight could get through. Felt like I had traveled back in time. It was completely silent, except for the leaves rustling and the wind making the cabin creak a little. I unpacked my stuff and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dust and wet wood. There were only 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen with an old, rusty stove, and the main room with a fireplace and a bed that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A few animal skins hung on the walls, giving the place a weird, distant feeling, like it didn't belong to this time. That first night, I started a fire in the fireplace and sat down to read. The wind was getting stronger outside, brushing against the cabin, but inside it was quiet, too quiet. I could only hear the fire crackling, and before I knew it, I was falling asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had almost burned out, leaving the room in complete darkness, and the wind outside was now a constant howl. At first, I thought it was just the noise that had woken me up, but then I heard something else, a soft scraping sound. It was faint, but I could hear it. It was coming from the back wall of the cabin, right behind the bed. I stayed still, listening carefully. The sound was quiet but steady, like something or someone was dragging something sharp across the wood. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to tell myself it was probably just an animal outside. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, hoping it would stop. Didn't. I got out of bed, grabbed the flashlight I had brought, and walked to the back window. I shone the light outside, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a branch scraping against the cabin. But there was nothing. The trees were swaying in the wind, leaves scattered on the ground, but no animal, no branch. I went back to bed, trying to brush it off, but the scraping kept going, slow and steady, all night long. By the next morning, the noise had stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I spent the day hiking around the woods nearby, trying to enjoy the quiet. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I stopped to look around, the trees were still, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. That night, as soon as the fire started to die down, the noise came back. This time, it was louder, and it wasn't just behind the bed. It was circling the cabin, slowly. The scraping sound moved around the outside walls, like something was dragging its nails along the wood, tracing a path around the cabin. Cold sweat started to drip down my neck. I grabbed the flashlight again and moved toward the door, ready to see what was out there. But the second my hand touched the doorknob, the scraping stopped. I stood there, frozen, listening. The silence was thick. Then I heard a heavy thud, right against the front door. I backed away slowly, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. For the next few hours, the noise picked up again, moving faster around the cabin, mixing with loud bangs against the walls. I felt trapped. Every time I thought about opening the door, the sound grew louder, like it was warning me to stay inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until the noise finally stopped, and as soon as the first bit of morning light came through the window, I grabbed my stuff and rushed to my car. I didn't care what was outside or what had been making those noises. I just knew I had to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It looked just the same as it did when I first got there, old, quiet, like it had been forgotten. But now, something about it felt different, as if it had been watching me the whole time. And the scraping stopped the second I left. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on familiar roads. I didn't look back after that. But whatever was out there, it was real, and it wasn't just in my head. I don't know why the noises only happened at night or what was causing them. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. I looked up the cabin when I got home, just to see if anyone else had noticed anything strange about it. The listing had been taken down, and I couldn't find it anywhere, like it had never existed. I don't know who or what was out there, but it didn't want me there. And I know I'll never be able to forget that sound. I was alone at my cabin for the weekend, a rare chance to get away from everything. My neighbor's cabin was only a short walk through the trees, but they were away on vacation. I had planned on a peaceful weekend of reading and relaxing, but things took a creepy turn. It started on the second night. I was lying in bed when I heard a faint noise outside, like something scraping along the ground. I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but it kept bothering me. I tried to ignore it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt leading from the neighbor's cabin toward mine. They were strange, not like any animal tracks I knew. I figured someone might have been passing through and just taken a shortcut. That night, the noise came back, but it was louder and closer. I stayed still, listening as the sounds moved around the cabin. It was clearly human footsteps and rustling. My heart raced as I lay there, too frightened to move. The cabin was locked tight, but I felt exposed and vulnerable. When the noise finally stopped, I forced myself to check outside. I saw that the tracks from earlier had changed direction. They led away from my cabin, back toward the neighbor's place. Something felt seriously wrong. I decided to act. I called the local sheriff's office and explained what was going on. They said they'd send someone over, though it might take some time. While I waited, I kept my phone close, staying alert and ready for anything. When the deputy arrived, they discovered signs of a break-in attempt at the neighbor's cabin. Turned out someone had been watching the area for days, planning to break in. They had also been keeping an eye on my cabin, maybe thinking about hitting it next. The deputy told me there had been a string of similar break-ins in the area and warned me to be extra cautious. The realization that someone had been so close, watching me, was terrifying. I was relieved I hadn't confronted them alone. The sheriff's office promised increased patrols, but the fear lingered. I made sure to lock every door and window tightly. That night, the cabin felt even more like a prison. I kept the lights on and the doors locked, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The peaceful retreat I had hoped for was replaced by a constant sense of dread. As I lay in bed, The sound of something scratching at the window made my blood run cold. I knew I wasn't alone, and the thought that someone might still be out there, waiting for their chance, left me with a chilling sense of fear. I'm a small-town police officer, and when I was assigned to watch over a cabin in the woods for a night, it seemed like an easy task. The cabin belonged to a retired officer who had recently passed away, and his family wanted to keep an eye on it until they decided what to do with it. My job was to patrol the cabin every few hours to make sure nothing was wrong. The cabin was in the middle of a thick forest, far from the nearest house. My job was to keep an eye on the place and make sure no one was breaking in. The cabin was old and creaky, but it had a kind of old-fashioned charm. I got there just before dark and set up my patrol plan, writing everything down in the logbook. Around midnight, I decided to walk around the cabin. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and a distant bird call. I didn't see anything strange until I got to the back of the cabin. That's when I noticed fresh footprints leading up to the back door. My heart started racing. I checked the door. It was locked, but the footprints went around the side of the cabin. I followed them carefully, shining my flashlight through the dark. The tracks led to a small shed behind the cabin. I approached the shed, my nerves on edge. The shed was old and looked like it hadn't been used in years. I slowly opened the door, and it creaked loudly. Inside, I found old tools and dusty furniture. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I spotted a small, dusty box in the corner. The box was open, and inside were old photos and papers. I picked up a photo and looked at it. It showed the retired officer with a group of men, all smiling and holding what looked like hunting rifles. Then, my flashlight beam moved and revealed something that made my blood run cold. There was a dark stain on the floor beneath the box, looking almost like spilled coffee but much more disturbing. I crouched down to look closer and realized it was dried blood. My mind raced. Why was there blood here and what had happened in this cabin? I called for backup and decided to wait by the cabin until they arrived. As I stood outside, I heard footsteps coming from the forest. I froze, swinging my flashlight towards the noise. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin, and I saw a shadowy figure through the window. Backup arrived quickly. Together, we searched the area but found nothing. The shadowy figure had disappeared, and the footprints in the shed were gone. We thoroughly checked the cabin and the shed, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could explain the blood or the figure I had seen. The case was never solved. The retired officer's family eventually decided to sell the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened there. Every time I drove past the cabin, I couldn't help but feel that the forest was hiding something. It was as if whatever had been in that cabin was still out there, waiting for someone else to uncover the truth. The feeling that something was watching me from the trees never left me, a constant reminder of the dark secrets buried in that quiet, forgotten place. I was stationed at a small outpost, far from anything familiar. The cabin we were assigned to wasn't much, just an old wooden shack barely big enough for 4 of us. It was stuck at the edge of a thick forest, the kind where the trees were so close together that barely any sunlight made it through, even during the day. Once you stepped into the trees, you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. It was dark, even when the sun was up. At first, the loneliness didn't really bother me. We were used to tough situations in the army, and this just felt like another mission. Days passed slowly, filled with routine checks, fixing up gear, and waiting for any new orders. But after a few weeks, the place started to get to me. It wasn't anything I could point out exactly, just a feeling. At night, the wind would howl through the trees, making strange noises. Sometimes it sounded like whispers, like someone was just out of sight, standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. One night, I was on guard duty while the others were sleeping in the cabin. I sat on the porch, staring out into the darkness. It was dead quiet, not even the usual rustling of leaves or sounds of animals moving around. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, and that's when I saw it. Something barely there, moving between the trees. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. I pointed the flashlight in its direction, but whatever it was had already slipped back into the shadows. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting, but nothing happened. Still, the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away, like something was pressing down on my chest. The next morning, I told the guys about what I saw, but they shrugged it off. Animals were common in this area, nothing to worry about. But no matter how much I tried to push it out of my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, more weird things started happening. Small things went missing: food, gear, stuff that couldn't just disappear on its own. One of the guys thought he heard footsteps outside the cabin late at night, but when we checked, there was no one there. Yet that feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Then one night, it all got worse. It was pitch black outside, and we were all inside the cabin, trying to get some sleep. Out of nowhere, there was a loud bang, like something heavy had smashed into the side of the cabin. We all jumped out of bed, grabbed our rifles, and ran outside. The cold night air hit me hard, and everything was silent. Too silent. I swept my flashlight around, and that's when we saw it. A huge tree, just a few feet from the cabin, had been pulled out of the ground. Its roots were sticking up into the air. There had been no storm, no strong wind. Nothing could have caused that. No sign of anyone around, no tracks in the dirt. It hit me then. Someone or something was messing with us. We stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to check the tree line, see if I could find any tracks or clues about what was out there. As I walked into the forest, the air felt thick, like something was weighing it down. My skin crawled, like I was being watched. Every few steps, I stopped and looked around, my heart beating faster with each pause. Then I saw it again, the figure, just standing there, barely visible between the trees, watching me. This time, I didn't wait. I lifted my rifle and stepped forward, but the figure bolted. I chased after it, my legs moving faster than I thought they could as I ran deeper into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. But after a few minutes, I stopped. The figure was gone, swallowed by the trees. My breathing was heavy, and as I stood there in the quiet, the truth of what was happening sank in. Whatever it wasn't just some animal. It was watching us, testing us. It was smart, waiting for the right moment. I made my way back to the cabin, the silence of the forest closing in on me. When I got back, I told the others what I had seen, but we didn't need to talk about it. We all knew something was out there, something we couldn't explain. We decided to pack up and leave at first light, but that night was the longest night of my life. None of us slept. Every noise outside sounded like a threat. Every shadow seemed to move. We sat there, rifles ready, just waiting for whatever it was to make its move. But nothing happened. When the sun finally came up, we packed our things and left. As we drove away from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. It was like the trees themselves had eyes on us. We never found out what had been stalking us. Maybe it's better that way, but the feeling stayed with me long after we left. Even now, I can't help but think about those eyes in the dark, following us as we drove off. It wasn't over. I know it's still out there, waiting for the next group to show up. I booked a cabin in the Austrian Alps because I needed to get away for a bit. Life had been too busy, and this place seemed like the perfect spot to relax. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees, and there was only a small dirt road leading up to it. When I arrived, I got out of the car, took a deep breath of the cool mountain air, and started unpacking. The view was amazing, and everything was so quiet. It felt like I was the only person around for miles. The cabin was old but clean. Inside, it had everything I needed: a fireplace, a little kitchen, and one bedroom. Over the next few days, I spent my time walking along the trails nearby, breathing in the fresh air and enjoying the silence. Sometimes, I'd hear animals moving around in the woods, but it was nothing that made me worry. At night, the wind would get louder, howling through the trees, but the cabin was sturdy, and I always felt warm and safe. It seemed like the perfect place to be. One evening, just before the sun went down, I decided to try a trail I hadn't walked before. It was steeper than the others and led further into the woods. After about an hour, the trail became harder to see, almost disappearing under the fallen leaves. The trees were getting closer together, and the shadows were growing longer. Part of me thought about turning back, but something made me keep going. It was like I had to see what was ahead. After another half hour of walking, I came across an old, broken-down shed in the middle of the forest. It looked like no one had touched it in a long time, maybe years. I got closer, but the whole thing felt strange, like it didn't belong there. The ground around it was messy, like something had walked through it recently, and I could smell something faint like burned wood. I didn't go inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been there not too long ago. I hurried back to the cabin before it got too dark, but as I walked, I felt uneasy, like something was watching me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing behind me, just the quiet woods. Still, the feeling stuck with me all the way back. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees were making all kinds of noises. As I lay in bed, I told myself that I was just spooked from finding that old shed. But around midnight, I heard something outside. This wasn't the wind. It was slow, heavy footsteps, like someone walking on the gravel outside the cabin. I froze. The footsteps were steady, moving around the cabin. I listened as they got closer, stopping right outside my bedroom window. My heart was racing, and I didn't move a muscle. There was a long pause, and then I heard a light scraping noise against the wall, like a branch or something else brushing against the wood. I held my breath and waited for the sound to go away. It took a while, but eventually, everything went quiet again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, lying there, wide awake, waiting for something else to happen. As soon as the sun came up, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to stay any longer. But as I loaded my stuff into the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh footprints in the dirt right outside the cabin. They didn't belong to me. I got in the car and drove off without looking back. The whole way down the mountain, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped for coffee, trying to calm myself down. I told myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that there was nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me that night. A few weeks later, I did some research on the area around the cabin. There wasn't much information online, but I did find something that made my blood run cold. A hiker had disappeared in those woods about 15 years ago. They never found him. His last known location? Not far from where I had found that old shed. Now, every time I think about that night, I can't help but wonder who or what was walking around my cabin. Maybe it wasn't the wind that woke me up. Maybe someone was there, standing just outside my window, watching me the whole time. And the thought that gets under my skin the most? They never found the missing hiker. Maybe they never looked in the right places. Or maybe They didn't want to find him. My mom and I decided to spend a weekend at an old cabin she used to visit when she was young. It was deep in the woods, far from any town or other people. She always said it was peaceful out there, so I thought it would be nice to get away for a few days. When we got there, the cabin looked old and worn out. The wood was dark, and the porch creaked with every step. Inside, it was basic, just a few rooms with old, dusty furniture. The smell of damp wood was heavy in the air. There was no electricity, just lanterns and a fireplace to light the place up. It felt like we were completely cut off from the world. The first night was calm. We had dinner, talked a bit, and went to bed early. I woke up a few times during the night, hearing noises outside, branches snapping, leaves moving, but it seemed normal for the woods. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel different. My mom went to bed early again, so I stayed up in the living room by myself, reading. The only light was from the lantern flickering beside me. The silence felt thick, almost like the woods had gone still. I started to feel a bit uneasy and put the book down. That's when I heard it. A light tapping sound coming from the front door. At first, I thought it was an animal or maybe a branch hitting the wood. But the tapping was too steady, too controlled. It didn't stop, just kept going, slow and even. I stared at the door, feeling a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Something was standing right outside. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. But the tapping kept getting louder, like whatever was making the noise was getting frustrated. My stomach turned, and I stood there frozen, not daring to move. I didn't want to make a sound. Then, as quickly as it started, the tapping stopped. The silence was so heavy it felt like the air had thickened. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. I started to walk toward my mom's room to check on her. But just as I moved, I heard something else. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was a soft scraping sound, coming from the side of the cabin. It was like something was dragging itself along the outside walls, moving slowly. The sound crept around the cabin, stopping every few feet, then starting again. My heart pounded as I stood there, listening to it get closer. I didn't know what to do. I glanced toward my mom's room, thinking maybe I should wake her, but I stayed still. I didn't want to scare her or admit how scared I was. The scraping finally stopped by the back door. I stood frozen, holding my breath. For a while, there was nothing. No noise, no movement. I almost started to believe it was over, that maybe it was just an animal. But then, I heard the back door creak. It didn't open, but it sounded like someone was testing it, pushing against it just enough to make the wood groan. That was it. I couldn't stay still anymore. I ran to my mom's room and shook her awake. We didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We just sat there listening. But the noise didn't come back. The cabin was silent again. We stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting together in her room, waiting for something to happen. But the cabin stayed quiet. When the sun finally came up, we didn't waste time. We packed up and left without even eating breakfast. Neither of us talked about what had happened. On the drive back, my mom kept staring out the window, her face pale and tight. She didn't look back at the cabin, not even once. I didn't either. We never talked about that weekend again. But I noticed my mom never suggested going back to that cabin. It was like we both agreed without saying anything that it was best to forget about it. But I can't forget. The tapping, the scraping, the way the door creaked under pressure. It's all stuck in my head. Sometimes, late at night, I lie in bed and hear it all over again, as if it's still out there. I keep thinking about how whoever or whatever was outside that night, it wasn't trying to get in. It already knew we were inside. It just wanted us to know that too. I'd been looking forward to this weekend at my grandfather's old cabin in the woods for months. It was a chance to get away from the daily grind and enjoy some peace and quiet. The cabin was an old, weather-beaten building tucked away in a far corner of the forest. My grandfather left it to me when he passed away, and it was my first time staying there alone. The drive up was smooth, and I unpacked my things into the cabin before getting comfortable for the night. The place was just as I remembered. The wooden floors creaked, the furniture was old and simple, and the smell of pine filled the air. I got a fire going in the old stone fireplace and settled down with a book, enjoying the warmth and the crackling flames. As night fell, the forest outside grew strangely silent. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant animals faded away, replaced by an eerie quiet. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just because of the remote location. Just as I was about to head to bed, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside the cabin. I thought it might be a raccoon or some other small animal, but the scratching continued. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin, near the storage shed. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed a flashlight to check it out. I stepped outside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The scratching sound stopped as soon as I approached the shed. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Deciding it was probably just an animal, I went back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been dropped. My heart raced as I lay in the dark, straining to hear any more noises. The silence returned, even more intense than before. I decided to check around the cabin, but everything seemed fine, and there was no sign of anything out of place. I went back to bed, but sleep was hard to come by. Around 3 a.m., I heard a thump and the unmistakable sound of something being dragged. This time, it was definitely coming from the direction of the shed. A cold feeling settled in my stomach, but I forced myself to get up and check it out. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside again, more on edge this time. The dragging sound stopped as soon as I reached the shed. I opened the door slowly and shone the flashlight inside. The shed was empty except for a few old tools and a pile of firewood. But then I noticed something unsettling. A long, deep scratch mark on the inside of the shed's wooden door. It looked like it had been made by something with sharp claws or a heavy, rough object. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I went back inside, locked the shed door, and checked all the windows and doors of the cabin to make sure they were secure. The rest of the night was nerve-wracking, but nothing else happened. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I spent the day packing up my things, eager to leave. I did one last check of the cabin and shed before driving away. Back home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to call a local handyman to secure the cabin and check for any signs of break-ins or damage. The handyman found no evidence of forced entry, but mentioned that the scratch marks on the shed door were strange and suggested installing better security measures. I never went back to the cabin after that. The thought of spending another night there, alone in the quiet with whatever made those scratching noises, was too unsettling. I later learned from a neighbor that a family living nearby had gone missing years ago. They had heard scratching noises at their cabin too. The police never found them, and no one knows what happened. The memory of that weekend stayed with me, a chilling reminder that sometimes silence is the most terrifying sound of all. I always thought getting away from the city and staying in an old cabin deep in the woods would be relaxing. I found this cabin online that looked perfect. The pictures showed a small, beat-up cabin tucked away between the trees. I figured spending a few nights there alone was just what I needed to clear my mind. When I got there, it was more isolated than I had imagined. No cell service, no neighbors, just miles and miles of thick forest. The cabin looked even older in person. The wood was turning gray, cracking in places, and the roof seemed to droop a bit. The windows were covered in dirt and grime, but I didn't care. Felt like stepping back in time. I unpacked, started a fire, and settled in for the night. That first night was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, just this strange, heavy silence. It felt off, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being so far away from people. The second day, things started to get weird. I decided to walk around the woods a bit, but as I wandered, I noticed signs that someone had been there recently. There were old tire tracks in the dirt, leading deeper into the forest. I hadn't seen any other cars on the way up, so it was strange. Then, not far from the cabin, I came across a rusty, broken-down car hidden behind some bushes. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Why would someone leave it there and not come back for it? That night, the feeling that something was off really started to get to me. I kept hearing noises outside. It sounded like soft footsteps just beyond the trees, like someone was walking around but never getting close. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The sounds were too steady, too slow. By the third day, I was on edge. That weird feeling stuck with me like a heavy weight on my chest. I stayed close to the cabin, barely venturing out. The silence that had seemed peaceful before now felt almost threatening, like the whole forest was watching me. I stayed near the fireplace, where I could keep an eye on the front door and windows. The quiet no longer felt calm. It felt like something was about to happen. That night, I decided to go to bed early. I locked the doors, shut the windows tight, and lay down, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was safe. Then, I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from the front door. It was slow at first, like someone dragging their fingers across the wood. My heart started racing. I held my breath, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. It got louder, more forceful, like something was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the window, my hands shaking. I didn't dare open the door, but I had to see what was out there. I shined the light through the window, but at first, I saw nothing, just the empty porch and the dark trees. Then the beam of light caught something. Deep scratches carved into the wood of the door. They weren't there before. A wave of panic hit me hard. Whatever had been outside was right there, close enough to touch the door, and it had been trying to get in. I backed away, my mind racing. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. I was completely alone, stuck in this old cabin with something waiting outside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room, staring at the door, waiting for the sun to come up. The scratching sound never came back, but the silence outside was somehow worse. It felt like something was still out there, watching, waiting for me to make a move. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things as fast as I could. I was ready to leave. When I stepped outside, that's when I saw it clearly. The scratches on the door weren't random. They were long and deep, like they had been made by someone with purpose, someone trying to get in. Not by an animal. I threw my stuff into the car and took off without looking back. I drove as far as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was out there hadn't just been watching from the trees. They were closer than I ever realized, waiting for the right moment to come inside. And the worst part? I don't think I was the first person they were waiting for, and I won't be the last. I was really looking forward to a quiet weekend at the cabin. It was way out in the woods, far from the city, and I had been there a few times before. There was no internet, barely any phone signal, but that's what I liked about it. Just peace, quiet, and a break from everything. When I got there, it looked just like I remembered. Small, cozy, and surrounded by nothing but trees. After dropping my bags inside, I started a fire in the wood stove and settled down. The air was cool, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Felt peaceful at first. As the sun went down, the cabin got darker. The shadows from the trees stretched across the windows, making everything look longer and strange. I lit a few candles and picked up a book. But even though I tried to focus on the words, I couldn't shake this weird feeling, like something wasn't right. You know when you just know something's off, but you can't say what it is? That's how it felt. At first, I told myself it was just because I was alone. Being out there, far from everything, can make you a little on edge. But every time I looked out the window, it felt like the darkness outside was looking back at me. I didn't like it. I decided to check the doors, even though I knew I had locked them. Front door locked, back door locked, windows closed. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but that uneasy feeling stuck with me. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. Every little sound outside seemed louder than it should have been. I thought I heard footsteps in the leaves outside, but maybe it was just an animal. I stayed in bed, telling myself it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. After a while, I finally fell asleep, but it wasn't a deep sleep. I kept waking up every now and then, feeling like something wasn't right. In the middle of the night, I woke up again. It was so quiet, no sound at all, not even the wind. My heart started pounding, even though I didn't know why. Then I heard it, a soft creak of the wooden floor inside the cabin. I froze. It wasn't the usual house sounds. It was different. It sounded like someone was stepping carefully on the floor. I stayed perfectly still, listening hard. There it was again, a quiet creak, closer this time. My mind was racing. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. No one even knew I was here, but someone was inside. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Slowly, I reached under the bed for the heavy flashlight I had brought. Another creak, this time right outside my bedroom door. I could hear them standing on the other side of the door. Whoever it was, they were just standing there, listening, waiting. I lay there, feeling my heartbeat in my ears, trying to figure out what to do. I could either stay frozen and hope they wouldn't come in, or I could try to make a run for it. I didn't have much time to think. I gripped the flashlight tighter. Then the door handle turned. Slowly, like they didn't want to make any noise, the door started to open. I jumped out of bed, swinging the flashlight toward the door. The light hit an empty room. No one was there, but I knew what I heard. Someone had been standing there. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in a chair with my back against the wall, holding the flashlight, my eyes glued to the door, just waiting. As soon as the sun came up, I grabbed my bag and left. I didn't stop walking until I was back at my car, parked a few miles away. I threw everything in and started the engine, but before driving off, I looked back at the cabin. Stood there, quiet, just like it always did. But something had been there with me. I didn't imagine it. Someone had been inside that cabin. A few weeks later, I heard on the news that hikers found an old, run-down cabin in those woods, not too far from where I'd been staying. Inside, they found signs that someone had been living there. Trash, old clothes, but no one was around. No one knew who it was or where they went. I don't know if it was the same cabin or if it was close by, but I can't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me that night. Maybe they're still out there. And I wonder if I had stayed one more night, would I have made it out of there? Or would I be the next story they found?